Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tonight, climate-fueled wildfires continue across the country, almost 15 times the 10-year average for this time of year. Upwards of 126,000 people across the country have been evacuated because of these fires. We know parents who are keeping their kids home from going to a playground because the air quality is so bad. Earlier this afternoon, I was pressing for an end to fossil fuel subsidies. I'm glad to be back in this House now after midnight to keep pressing for solutions, real climate solutions, like public transit, for example. Because for us in Ontario, transportation is the largest source of emissions at 32%. And while electric vehicles may be part of the solution, they also have many drawbacks, including contributing to more sprawl and poor land use planning decisions, the embodied carbon of manufacturing EVs, the rare metals that are needed to manufacture them, and that owning a car remains out of reach for many in my community. Canadian transit riders, by comparison, are disproportionately low-income workers. They are women and people from racialized communities. Many can't afford to drive. 64% have no access to a car amongst those who take transit. It's why prior to this year's budget, I was pressing for the governing party to invest more in public transit, specifically recognizing that municipalities like mine are being forced to raise fares while in some cases simultaneously cutting services due to a lack of sufficient investment from higher orders of government. Not that there's none, but that it is insufficient. Specifically, that groups across the country, like Environmental Defence and the Canadian Urban Transit Association, they were sounding the alarm at the time, warning that transit systems are at risk of falling into a death spiral without critical operational support that had run out since the worst of the pandemic. And sadly, the budget missed the mark with no new transit funds committed. This is what Nate Wallace, Program Manager for Clean Transportation at Environmental Defence, had to say, quote, "It is very disappointing to see that this budget does not include much needed funds to support transit systems now." Truthfully, to me, it's a shame we're even talking about this. If we were responding to the climate crisis at the scale required, we wouldn't just be talking about emergency operating funds. We need to actually be talking about going a step further, and I believe the Parliamentary Secretary may agree with me on this, that we actually need federal funds so that we can scale successful efforts to reduce fares altogether. One example is actually started by a friend of mine, Dan Hendry, co-founder and director of Get on the Bus, who piloted a program in Kingston, Ontario that provided on-bus training and free transit passes to high school students specifically. The impact? High school ridership increased from 28,000 rides in 2012 to close to 600,000 rides annually. Exponential growth in ridership amongst high school students by providing training and free bus passes. Municipal leaders in my community are now looking at this model, and I'd love for them to do it. I want young people in Waterloo Region to have better options, but municipal leaders are having to discuss this without the benefit of federal funds to subsidize it. So my question is, will the governing party step up for these emergency funds and go further recognizing the crisis we're in?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And in fact, public transit is something dear to my heart. In fact, I don't own a car myself, and I would say one piece more. I actually think that an important part of public transit is including active transportation infrastructure, which is why I'm so proud that our government created the first National Active Transportation Fund. But I will want to say, for sure, support for transit means greater quality of life for Canadians, and our government has made the largest investment in public transit in history. Since 2015, we have provided over $20 billion in federal funding to support public transit projects in communities across Canada. And to ensure that Canadians continue to benefit from transit options, the Government of Canada has introduced the Permanent Public Transit Program. I can't underline the importance of that enough. It's permanent funding. It provides federal funding to support projects that deliver expanded urban transit networks, affordable zero-emission transit options, transit solutions for rural communities, and additional active transportation options. The Permanent Public Transit Program provides $14.9 billion over 8 years, including $3 billion per year ongoing starting 26-27. This commitment builds on the support already available for transit across the country from existing federal programs, support that has been crucial during the pandemic as ridership has seen significant declines. The investments we are making in public transit will also reduce greenhouse gases through a commitment to support zero-emission transit options. That's why the Government of Canada is investing $2.75 billion through the Zero Emission Transit Fund to help transit and school bus operators fund new vehicles and necessary supporting infrastructure as they transition their fleets. One exciting part, Mr. Speaker, this also helps to create jobs in some of our communities. For example, the City of Toronto has purchased buses that are manufactured in Winnipeg. So there's another piece to this as well. Outside urban areas, we are helping to get Canadians moving through the $250 million Rural Transit Solutions Fund, the first federal fund to target the development of locally driven transit solutions for rural, remote, and Indigenous communities. The Government of Canada's continued investments in transit will help provide options for Canadians. Our investment in public transit is helping to provide an essential service to many Canadians, generate billions of dollars in economic benefits, and help Canada meet its climate targets as we approach 2050. Now that public transit ridership in communities across the country is rebounding, the Government of Canada is supporting a strong and sustainable comeback. Through the Safe Restart Agreement announced in 2020, our government committed to an investment of up to $2 billion to support municipalities with COVID-19 operating costs. We also committed to an investment of an additional $2.4 billion in funds to match provincial and territorial funding to support local transit authorities in cities and towns across Canada. This investment is helping our cities and towns to keep their transit systems running so that Canadians can get to work and home to their families safely. For example, in British Columbia, the Safe Restart Agreement committed additional $540 million in federal transit funding to support local transit authorities across the province. The transit investments that we are making will reduce greenhouse gas emissions, provide health benefits, and better serve disadvantaged groups, including women, seniors, youth, and people who have low incomes. Public transit is very important. We are continuing to support it, and we will continue to do so. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I really appreciate, and I expected this evening, that I don't need to convince the Parliamentary Secretary about the importance of transit as a transit user herself. It means we can have a more adult conversation about what needs to be done in the midst of the crisis that we're in. And so, again, I recognize and appreciate the funds that have been allocated in the past on transit, but also want her to recognize, and the governing party, that this is not sufficient. One, it's not sufficient in terms of emergency operating funds that organizations across the country had been calling for and were not delivered. And secondly, not sufficient to ensure we can actually reduce fares to increase ridership at the pace required for young people, for example, to start habits of using transit from a young age and continue doing so that we can shift the curve on the climate crisis and address the transit and transportation emissions we know we have. And so my question back to her is, how will she continue to advocate within the governing party to see the investments increase at the pace that this crisis requires?
Well, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think that the member opposite myself, we can agree that public transit is very important, and it's important for all of the reasons that he listed, including the fact, Mr. Speaker, that it helps people to get around. It's better for emissions, better for clean air in our communities, and frankly, it allows for a certain amount of freedom, particularly for young people who are too young to even have a driver's license. And so it is very important that we have a strong public transit system. And that's why I think it's really important to recognize all of the investments that our government has made to date, and including, and I will reiterate this, the Permanent Public Transit Program, which was introduced in 2021. It provides $14.9 billion over 8 years, including $3 billion per year ongoing starting 2026 to 2027. That's how we're going to continue to support public transit. Thank you.